Well, the holiday season is here, right? Megan just shared she's been putting up her Christmas lights. Anybody else? Christmas lights going up already? Yeah. Christmas trees and getting there. My family last week was like, Christmas tree, we got to go get the Christmas tree. I was like, absolutely not until after Thanksgiving. So Friday afternoon, we went and got our Christmas tree. It's all decorated. Thanksgiving is done. Christmas is coming, and the burnout of January is just around the corner, right? We started off this series asking the question, what if it didn't have to be that way? What if we could get through the holiday season and come out the other side with actually feeling like we've had some rest, some peace, some quiet? And over the past few weeks, it's why we've been sifting through the chaos and pace of our life and what we prioritize, that we would prioritize not just what is good, but what is best. To create the margin, to find the space. Because there are so many things. We've talked about 2 weeks ago, Reg from our Lake Zurich campus came and preached and shared some finances message with us. And what it looks like when a good thing like our finances end up getting in the way and crowding out the best thing of the resources that God has given us to be a blessing. And then last week, Pastor Sam unpacked the condition of our heart. And when our heart is twisted, when our heart is crowded, it twists and perverts our pursuits. And we've been looking at how to find margin in the midst of all of this. And we've defined margin as the difference between what you have and what you need. Or another way of saying this is that margin is the space between your current pace and your limits. We all have limits, don't we? Don't we? I know I do. Right? We've got limits spiritually. We've got limits relationally, financially. We certainly have limits as it relates to our time. And when there's no margin in our life, the stress increases. And our relationships and our intimacy begins to decrease. And the anxiety and worry begins to grow. And whether we like to admit it or not, we all have this tendency of trying to pack more in, while not making room and removing other things. We just take on more and more without ever taking something out. And so we settle for a pace and a place that God never designed us to live in. And we've become comfortable with doing so much, even though we end up not enjoying much of what we do. And what I love about this whole idea and this whole reality of our lives that we take on, that we have lives that are so consumed that we have very little margin, is that God knew that this would be an issue for us. And He didn't leave us without some instruction, without some practical examples and teaching to help us and navigate and guide us through these struggles. See, when God established the nation of Israel, the Israelite people, He gave them a command to rest, to live in His rhythm of grace, to run and to rest, to work and to take a step back. Because God knew that we function best when we create space for Him to prioritize rest in our lives, to chase what's most important, to chase not just what is good, but what is best. And so today we're going to see what God says about time, about rest, about navigating the stresses and the things that try to consume our lives. And I truly believe that what God says about this can change the quality of your life, because if you apply what we're looking at today, it could change your time. And as your schedule goes, so goes your life. That's our big idea today. Your time is your life. Your time is your life. What we're going to be unpacking today is this reality that your time, it's the days that you have here on earth. It represents your life. And how you spend your time directly relates to what you're going to do with your life. And God teaches us something about this in Psalm 90. If you've got your Bible, you can turn to Psalm 90. If you don't have a Bible, you can scan that QR code with the camera app on your phone and click the Bible. It'll take you right to Psalm 90. Psalm 90 is actually written by Moses. It was one of Moses' journal entries, if you will, one of his prayers that helps give us perspective on this idea of margin. And then David took Moses' writing and he kind of copied it down and inserted it into his own journal. And this psalm was written by Moses, who in a moment of honest reflection pens these words to God and gives us the context of our decisions as it relates to time. It's written when Moses was writing, the language was ancient Hebrew. And so he's writing in ancient Hebrew, which makes for some interesting translations over to English, some interesting idioms attached, and often the translation from ancient Hebrew to English can come across fairly confusing, which is why we're going to unpack verse by verse through Psalm 90 to paint a picture of what the greatness of God looks like in comparison to our existence as his creation. As we jump in, would you pray with me? God, I thank you for today. I thank you for those that you have brought here. It's not on accident that we have come to gather to hear from you. And so today I pray that you would speak to us through the power of your word, through the principles that you would have us live out to impact how we think, what we say, and how we live. And God, would you meet us here? Would you speak powerfully through your word and by your spirit in Jesus' name? Amen. Psalm 90, you know Moses wrote it because in my Bible it says a prayer of Moses, the man of God. That's just what helps me my job's not that hard, right? I just do what it says in here and tell you about it. Psalm 90 verse 1, it says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. This is what Moses is saying. He's saying, God, you are eternal. When it comes to God, the arrows go in both directions. You remember like math class? It was math class, right? Where you had the arrow and there's a dot on one end and like the arrow on the other. And if the arrow, is that math class or science? I wasn't great in school, but you know what I'm talking about, right? If there was a dot, it means the timeline stops. Well, for God, there's arrows on both ends and it just goes on forever. He has no beginning. He has no end, from everlasting to everlasting. And you and I are found somewhere in between, in the middle. He says, God, you are eternal. And then he continues in verse 3 and he says, you return man to dust and say, return, O children of men. He's saying, God, you're eternal and I'm temporary. I go back to dust. I go back into the ground. You live forever. You have no dot at the end of, or at the beginning of, and yet my life has a dot at the beginning and will have a dot at the end. God, you are awesome and I am less so. He says, God, you're great. And then he continues to elaborate, verse 4. He says, for 1,000 years in your sight, God, are but as yesterday when it passed, or as the watch in the night. Well, a watch in the night at that time in Moses' life, it was considered to be a 3-hour shift. In other words, God, you're so vast and so great that 1,000 years to you, or 1,000 years to us, man, it's like a 3-hour shift. It's like a blip on the radar. It's like it barely matters. And Moses is writing all of this down after taking some honest inventory of his life in light of the greatness of God and his purpose and plan for creation. And Moses is saying, so my life, as brief as it is, it's a big deal to me. Is your life a big deal to you? My life's a big deal to me. Like I care about my life. Moses cares about his life, and yet he says, but I don't live my life in the context of everlasting. I'm finite. I'm temporary. I don't live my life like I'm getting older, though. I don't live my life with this urgency setting in. Moses is revealing some perspective here that we need to dig into because he's showing us how to think about the time that we've been given, because our time is our life. In Psalm 90, verse 5, he continues. He says, you sweep them away as with a flood. They're like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed, and in the evening it fades and withers. What is he talking about? I told you some of the translation from ancient Hebrew to English, what's he talking? He's talking about creation. He's talking about you and me. He's talking about our life. And he says our life, it's like it's swept away with the flood. It's like a dream. It's there and then gone, like grass that grows in the morning and then withers and dies in the evening. He goes on and he gives some motivational speech about the insignificance of our life. Hey, you're like grass. You grow in the morning, and by the evening, you're done. You're like a mist, like a fog that's there in the morning and then goes away. In the light of God's greatness, you're not all that important. But hear me, because Moses is not trying, aren't you encouraged? Like Moses isn't trying to, he's not trying to make you feel worthless. But he is trying to establish God's greatness. He is trying to give us some perspective. He is trying to help us unpack this idea of who he is and who I am. And he continues in verse 10. He says, the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. And what he's saying is our life, look, you may live to 70, 80, you may by strength. He's not talking specifically about a number of years that you live as much as, look, you're going to live 70, 80, 100 years maybe, but it's going to end. It's going to stop. It's going to fade away. Your life, in the grand scheme of eternity, all right, so my Bible is 1,042 pages, okay? Yeah, 1,042 pages long. If this represents 1,000 years, where do you think you fit into the story? You're like a period on a page somewhere, right? Not all that significant in the whole span of eternity. Compared to God, I'm nothing. Life is short and God is eternal, and so I must need him. And if you're not familiar with Moses' life, he knew a few things about toil. He knew a few things about pain and sorrow. Moses' life came at a time where babies were being murdered and kind of cleared out. He was saved by being hidden along the river's edge. Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses kind of hidden in this basket, and she takes him, raises him as her own. He grows up in the palace. As he grows up, he begins to realize he's different. He begins to realize who he actually is, that he's an Israelite, not an Egyptian. Though he was raised in the palace, he realizes who he is. At some point in his young adult life, he murders an Egyptian soldier. And out of fear of his life, he runs away. And for 40 years, he spends his life as a shepherd. He goes from the palace to the fields, and this is now his life. He wakes up in the morning, he grabs some food, and he goes watches some sheep. In the middle of the day, he takes a nap, and then he goes and watches some sheep. He gets up and gets some food, and then he goes and watches some sheep, and then he goes to sleep, and then he does it all over again. Wake up, food, sheep, sleep, food, wake up, sleep, sheep, on and on. For 40 years, this is the man's life. And I'm sure it was easy for him to believe this is all there is ever going to be. This is now my life. Have you been there? Are you maybe there right now? Thinking that this is all that there ever is going to be, stuck in the repetition and monotony of like another Groundhog Day. This is Moses' life, but God had a plan for Moses. And God tells Moses to go back to the palace and demand freedom for the Israelite people. And after some miraculous things, you can read all about it in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. After God uses Moses to free the people, Moses' life is now taken off. It's looking good, but Moses is soon going to discover that God's plans often look different than ours. And after freeing the people, he spends the next 40 years wandering around in a circle with a bunch of whiny and complaining people. Some people call that pastoring. Not me. Of course, I mean, you guys are great. And if that wasn't enough, before the people of God were headed into the promised land, God says to Moses, you're not going to go. You're not going in. I'm going to have Joshua do that. And Moses knows a few things about trouble, about the ups and downs of life. And he understands the perspective. And it's out of this experience that he is writing this prayer to God. And there's a powerful truth that I want us to take with us and apply it to our lives. It's found in verse 11. As he continues, he says, "Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you?" Who considers your power? Who considers your anger and your wrath according to fear? Like, who knows you so well? Like I said, going from ancient Hebrew to English can sometimes be confusing. And let me just translate the theme of what Moses is writing here in verse 11. Reduce it all down to one sentence, it would be this: if you could see God for who he really is, you would give him the trust that he is due. That's what Moses is saying. Like, who knows you so well? Who knows your anger? Who knows your fear? If you could see God for who he really is, you would give him the trust that he is due. If I could see God's faithfulness, how he's still present even when I thought he was absent, that he's still near when I thought he was far off, that he's working even when I couldn't see it. If I could see God for who he really is, I wouldn't have any trouble trusting his perspective on life. And Moses is helping shape our perspective through this prayer in Psalm 90. And he's saying God is everlasting to everlasting, and I'm the grass that grows up between and withers in a single day. And so I can trust the God who has a perspective on eternity. I can trust God and his perspective on life. But hear me, church, because the value and the purpose of your life is not in the grass that withers. The value of your life, the purpose of your life is that you're part of a greater story. You're part of a bigger picture. You are part of the everlasting to everlasting perspective. That's the context of our life. And so he says, God, in light of who you are, God, in light of your eternality and my temporariness, verse 12, God, in light of who you are, teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days, that we would have a right perspective of who you are and who I am, that my time is short. And so I want to use it wisely. I want to use it for eternal purposes, not temporary ones. See, living with margin in your life and in your schedule, it takes intentionality. It takes prioritizing not just what is good, but what is best. And if you're anything like me, you don't have to live life very long to realize we don't live as if our days are numbered. If you think about it, if you think you're the exception, if you're a high schooler or a college student here today, if you're a child and you're thinking, man, I'm going to live forever. I can't wait till I grow up. I can't wait. Let me just tell you, the odds aren't in your favor. There is a 100% chance that your days will come to an end. And in the back of our minds, we know that we're not going to live forever, but in terms of how we prioritize our life, in terms of how we schedule what is important versus what is most important, and as it relates to what is good and best in our lives, we live our days as if they're not numbered. And we start thinking we can catch up later. We can take care of that later. I can figure this out in the future. I can repair that down the road. And we end up spending our time, which is our life, on many things that bring little value when we see them through an eternal perspective of our existence. And here's what's so sad. We spend our lives trying to acquire and attain something that proves how valuable we are, while all the time chasing those things is what pulls us away from the one who actually gives us our value and worth. And in doing so, we live with a wrong perspective of God. We live with a wrong perspective of our purpose. We live with a wrong perspective of our time and our existence. And we end up with a lot of years that we wish we could go back and get back. And so Moses is writing Psalm 90, warning us, don't make that mistake. Don't live like that. Live as if your days are numbered. Because when you realize that your time is limited, it provides you with the wisdom to know how to spend your limited time. When you live as if your days are numbered, it gives you the wisdom how you're going to spend the rest of your limited time. Imagine for a moment if you could fast forward your life to the very end, to your last few days, and look back and ask yourself, or have someone ask you, what regrets do you have? That's why I love the movie Click. Anybody know what I'm talking about? With Adam Sandler. And he gets this magic remote, and he fast forwards through the annoyance. He fast forwards through some difficult work seasons so that just get me to my promotion. And he finds himself at the end of his life, fast forwarding through all the things that mattered, looking back and regretting all the times that he had missed. What if you had the magic remote and fast forwarded to the end of your life and looked back, and what would the regrets be? A hospice nurse by the name of Bronnie Ware actually asked this question to her patients. And she spent the last 12 weeks with them and collected their answers and found a common theme of people that were at the end of their life looking back at their paths and their legacy and their choices. And she asked them what their regrets were. She compiled the answers into a book called The Top 5 Regrets of Dying. You know what's fascinating is that they reveal much of what Moses understood thousands of years earlier. She said this: people grew a lot when they're faced with their own mortality. I learned never to underestimate someone's capacity for growth. Some changes were phenomenal. Each experienced a variety of emotions, as expected: denial and fear, anger, remorse, more denial, eventually acceptance. I want to share with you the top 2 regrets of the dying. Number 2 regret is, I wish I didn't work so hard. I wish I didn't work so hard. This is what Moses was saying in verse 10. I work so hard, and for what? I do so much, and yet it fades and withers. She said this, she said, this came from every male patient. This regret, I wish I didn't work so hard. It came from every male patient that I nursed. They missed their children's youth, their partner's companionship. Women also spoke of this regret, but as most were of an older generation, many of the female patients had not been the breadwinners. All of the men I nursed deeply regretted spending so much time of their lives on the treadmill of their work existence. Isn't it fascinating? She then says this: by simplifying your life and making conscious choices along the way, it is possible to not need the income that you think you do. And by creating more space in your life, you become happier and more open to new opportunities, ones more suited to your new lifestyle. This is what she discovered. If you don't learn to number your days, you're going to misspend the life that you've been given and end up with a lot of regrets. Church, it's time to create some breathing room. It's time to create some margin. Moses says, teach us. God, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? It feels like it's been forever, and God's like, a couple seconds maybe. Have pity on your servants. Here's a perspective of our temporariness. Have pity on your servants. God, only you can satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all of our days. That only comes from you, God. So make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have been evil. Let us work. Let our work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. And God, would you come? Would you show up? God, would you, I recognize who I am. I recognize who you are. Show us your glorious power. Here's the number 1 regret that this nurse recorded. She said, I wished The number one regret, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself and not the life others expected of me. She said this was the most common regret of all. When people realized that their life was almost over and looked back clearly on it, they saw how many dreams had gone unfulfilled. Most people had not honored even half of the dreams that they had had. And they had to die knowing that due to the choices that they made or the choices they didn't make, the dreams would go unfulfilled. As we wrap up today, let me just ask you, are you making decisions? Are you making plans? Are you prioritizing your life based on what really matters? Or based on just what gets first dibs? Because when you realize your time is limited, it provides you the wisdom on how you will spend your limited time. Moses wraps up this prayer in verse 17. He says this: "Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us." Yes, establish the work of our hands. This is Moses' prayer, and I encourage you to make it yours. See, what he's saying here is, God, I need your blessing. I recognize my temporary life, and I recognize your eternality. So God, let your favor be on us. Establish, use my little life of a dot for an eternal purpose. God, I want all that I do in life to matter. I trust you with my life, and I want you to use it to be part of your everlasting plan. I don't want it to be some insignificant period or comma in the story. I want it to be an exclamation point. And here's my challenge for us today. When you walked in, you received a card that said margin on the top, a half sheet of paper, and if you would pull that out, you can take some time now or at some point today, maybe with your spouse or a friend, but just go through that card and process through, what are the things in my life or what are the things missing that I need to add? That's a little plus sign. What are the things I need to add to my life that are missing? What are the areas that I need to remove? What are the things I need to get rid of? A relationship, an activity, a hobby. What's taking up some of the margin that's keeping me from adding the things that are most important? What is it that I need to do less of? To dial back. Not a bad thing, but it's taking over and I just need to do less. And what is it that I need to dial up? What do I need to increase? And here's why I say do this with a trusted friend or a spouse. Because if you don't make a change, if you don't process it and make a concrete decision of change, you'll end up at the same place you are next year. You'll go through another holiday, another season, another year without any margin. But we want to spend our lives on something that matters. Our time is limited. We're temporary. But God has a plan for us like he had a plan for Moses. He can use us to be more than an insignificant life. We are part of a bigger perspective, part of a bigger story. Let's reclaim some of the space to use our life in ways that bring glory to God in the things that we say, think, and do.